At the beginning of the 20th century, Britain did not look like a state about to improvise one of the most consequential promises in modern history. It looked, as it liked to see itself, like the natural manager of the world. The sea lanes were guarded by the Royal Navy, London was the clearinghouse of global finance, sterling was trusted. The Bank of England stood behind a system that made British power feel less like conquest than climate. In 1913 and 1914, on the eve of catastrophe, British public debt had been pushed down to roughly 29% of GDP, a two-century low. Government still operated in a recognizably old liberal style, limited, balanced, restrained. An empire can look most permanent just before it begins borrowing against the future. Then the war arrived and tore the mask off the machine. The same state that had ruled through confidence now had to rule through credit. The same empire that had preached balance now devoured cash on a scale previously associated with dynastic collapse. By 1917 and 1918, British spending had exploded. Men, shells, ships, horses, wheat, nitrates, steel, uniforms, freight, insurance, munitions, subsidies, loans to allies, everything had to be purchased at once, and mostly with money Britain did not have. The war was not just a trench system in Flanders, it was a furnace for balance sheets. And as the bill rose, British officials began looking at the map in a different way, not as a geography of ancient loyalties, as collateral, as leverage. As inducement, that is the world in which Palestine reappears, not merely as a biblical place or an Ottoman province, but as a diplomatic asset in a war of exhaustion. Later generations would remember the Balfour Declaration as a sentence in a letter, a gesture, a promise, a sin, a founding text, depending on where they stood. But in 1917, it emerged from a government drowning in costs, improvising strategy under pressure, and increasingly willing to make overlapping promises to anyone it thought might help it win. Not because London had one pure motive, empires rarely do, because by the fourth year of the war, motive itself had become layered, frantic, and transactional. The object at the center of this story is almost absurdly small, one page. Dated November 2, 1917, folded, signed, and sent from Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour to Lord Rothschild. It contained just a few lines, but those lines would be treated as if they had title deed authority over a country Britain did not yet fully control. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It said, before adding the famous assurance that nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Civil and religious rights, not political rights. That omission would echo for a century. The letter was addressed to a Rothschild, which has made it irresistible to every crude conspiracy merchant ever since. But the real scandal is not that a banker secretly bought a country with a note from Whitehall. The real scandal is more bureaucratic, more imperial, and in some ways more unsettling. British policymakers had begun to think that support for Zionism might help finance a desperate war, influence opinion in the United States and Russia, and strengthen Britain's post-war claim to a strategic land bridge near Egypt and the Suez Canal. So why did a nearly bankrupt empire write that letter when it did? By the time the declaration was issued, Britain had been bleeding money for more than 3 years. The raw scale is easy to miss because modern states are always large and modern wars are always described in abstractions. But contemporaries felt the lurch in their bones. According to the International Encyclopedia of the First World War, imperial expenditure had been about £197.5 million in 1913-14. By 1914-15 it had jumped to £560, £5 million. By 1915-16 it reached £1,559 billion. By 1916-17, £2. 198 billion. By 1917-18, to £696 billion. Even in 1918-19, after the armistice, expenditure still stood at £2. 579 billion. A state designed for peacetime administration had become a suction pump for war material. The debt followed the same vertical line. Britain's national debt, which had stood at £651 million on March 31, 1914, rose to £171 billion by the armistice in November 1918, including £1. 420 billion in floating debt. The Office for Budget Responsibility, looking back over 3 centuries of British public finance, describes the war as the moment when spending leapt to 62% of GDP and debt climbed to 143% of GDP by 1918-19. This was not ordinary overstretch, this was fiscal transformation. A whole governing philosophy gave way under shellfire, and the tax state could not keep up. Wartime taxation met only about 26% of British expenditure. That is the kind of number that forces a government to stop speaking in moral language and start speaking in funding language. Taxes rose, yes, the number of income tax payers tripled, but taxation alone was hopelessly inadequate. Britain had to borrow again, then turn to external financing. In 1915, a massive Anglo-French loan of $500 million was floated in the United States. Between 1915 and 1919, the American Dollar Securities Committee bought or borrowed bonds and shares worth $423 billion. The very architecture of imperial power was being fed into a transatlantic credit machine. Then came the shift that mattered most. Between 1917 and 1920, according to the IMF's historical account of interallied debts, the United States Treasury extended $9.5 billion in loans to Britain, France, Italy, and other Entente allies. Great Britain alone owed the United States $696 billion at the armistice, and the broader figure later attached to Britain's debt to the U.S. Treasury reached $4.7 billion. Britain had once acted as banker to its alliance system. Now it was becoming a debtor to a rising creditor republic across the Atlantic. The empire could still command armies. It could no longer pretend money was incidental. This matters because when states become financially desperate, they begin to see diplomacy through the lens of solvency. They overvalue influence. They look for shortcuts. They convince themselves that the right declaration, the right signal, the right relationship might unlock support in places where ordinary military force cannot reach. And by 1917, British policymakers were telling themselves stories about where such support might come from. One of those stories concerned what Jonathan Schneer has called, in effect, British belief in world Jewry as a political force that might be tilted toward the Allied side. It was a fantasy with consequences. British elites did not all agree on Zionism, but many of them did share an inflated view of Jewish financial and political influence, especially in the United States and revolutionary Russia. James Renton, too, has emphasized that British policymakers believed Jews possessed real and significant power that could be useful in wartime. This was not admiration in any clean sense. It was a mix of opportunism, imperial calculation, Protestant sentiment, and anti-Semitic stereotype. A toxic compound, but useful, they thought. The Rothschild archive itself, in a strikingly candid summary, says that beginning in 1916, the British hoped that, in exchange for support of Zionism, the Jews would help finance the growing expenses of the First World War, and that officials believed Jews could be prevailed upon to persuade the United States to join the war. There it is in plain language, not a signed mortgage deed for Palestine, not a literal bank purchase. Something stranger and more revealing, a great power under unbearable fiscal strain, persuading itself that a political promise in the Middle East could trigger favorable movement in the hidden circuits of money and influence. There were strategic calculations as well, and these mattered just as much. Palestine sat near the approaches to Egypt and the Suez Canal, the imperial artery to India. Mainstream historical accounts consistently point to that. Britain also wanted to shape the post-Ottoman map before France did. The declaration helped create a moral and diplomatic case for British presence in Palestine after the war, especially against the background of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the wider scramble for Ottoman spoils. Tom Segev later put the logic with brutal economy. Britain entered Palestine to defeat the Turks, stayed to keep it from the French, and gave it to the Zionists because it believed that would keep the Jews on its side. The sentence is too neat for the full truth, but it gets uncomfortably close. Still, ideas do not move governments by themselves, people do, and if this story has a human engine, it is Chaim Weizmann. Before he became the first president of Israel, before he became one of the most consequential lobbyists of the 20th century, he was a chemist from the Russian Empire, shaped by the humiliations that helped produce political Zionism in the first place. He was not born into imperial power, he learned how to speak to it, That is a different skill and sometimes a more dangerous one. Weizmann arrived in Britain in the early 20th century carrying both conviction and tactical instinct. He understood something many ideologues miss: governments do not need to agree with your dreams, they only need to believe your dreams can serve their interests. He also possessed exactly the kind of credibility wartime Britain valued. His scientific work on acetone production, useful for explosives manufacture, gave him access to the upper reaches of British political life. That did not buy the Declaration in any crude sense. History is rarely that vulgar. But it gave him entree, reputation, and the aura of a man already useful to the war effort. By every contemporary account, he was formidable in person. Schneer describes his charisma almost as a weapon. Weizmann could flatter religious sentiment in one room, strategic thinking in another, and vanity in a third. He cultivated Arthur Balfour, David Lloyd George, Mark Sykes, and others with remarkable patience. He also grasped the warped assumptions already present in elite British thinking and turned them to Zionist advantage. If policymakers believed Jews had global influence, Weizmann did not waste breath trying to deconstruct the prejudice. He redirected it: political jiu-jitsu. Nasty, brilliant, effective. There is a dry irony here. An empire exhausted by war convinced itself that a people it had often excluded, patronized, or stereotyped might now help rescue it, militarily, diplomatically, financially, psychologically. And the Zionist movement, or at least its most gifted representatives in London, recognized the opening at once. Shared idealism was part of it. So was shared utility. That combination can move mountains or borders. The decisive scene came not on some romantic hill in Jerusalem, but in the airless machinery of British wartime government. Through 1917, draft after draft of a proposed declaration circulated among ministers, Zionist representatives, and critics. At Balfour's request, Weizmann and Lord Rothschild helped draft language that would suit Zionist interests. British ministers debated wording with the precision of men editing a legal instrument and the recklessness of men gambling with someone else's country. National home was preferred over state, vague enough to sell, strong enough to matter. The wider military situation sharpened the urgency. Late 1917 was a moment of Allied anxiety. Russia was collapsing into revolution. The United States had entered the war but had not yet decisively transformed the battlefield. British campaigns in Palestine had stalled before finally breaking through at Beersheba on October 31. In that atmosphere, every possible lever of advantage acquired exaggerated importance. One cabinet discussion even stressed the propaganda benefits that might be obtained among Jewish communities worldwide for the Allied war effort. Another recorded that President Wilson's views should be obtained before any declaration was made. Ministers later recalled Balfour saying Wilson was extremely favorable to the movement. The language of principle was there. So was the language of utility. So imagine the room properly, not as a council of pure ideologues and not as a gang of cartoon villains, something more ordinary, which is why it matters. Men under pressure, men thinking in memoranda. Men who believed imperial control of Palestine might protect the canal and check the French. Men who believed, some out of biblical sympathy and some out of old prejudice, that Zionism might rally opinion in America and Russia. Men who knew the treasury was straining and the war was eating everything. Men who had already promised the Arabs independence in one set of communications and promised the French an international arrangement in another. And now these same men were polishing a sentence to Lord Rothschild as if language itself could refinance strategy. When the approval came on October 31 and the letter followed on November 2, no gold changed hands in that room. No banker opened a vault and exchanged Palestine for a war bond. That is the childish version. The adult version is worse. A desperate imperial cabinet converted a territory and its people into a diplomatic inducement because it believed the gesture might yield strategic, political, and even financial advantage in a total war. There was, however, another voice inside the British state, and it did not sound like triumph. Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India and the only Jewish member of the British cabinet, saw the proposal and recoiled. At first glance, his story seems separate, almost like a footnote in the drama of high strategy. It was anything but. He understood, perhaps more clearly than the enthusiasts around him, the contradiction buried in the declaration's language. Montagu opposed Zionism with fury. He called it a mischievous political creed, untenable by any patriotic citizens of the United Kingdom. He rejected the very idea that there existed a single Jewish nation in the political sense the declaration implied. And he warned that if Britain declared Palestine the national home of the Jews, every country might decide to rid itself of its Jewish citizens. Palestine will become the world's ghetto, he wrote. The phrase lands like a prophecy and an accusation at the same time. He also saw what many British officials preferred not to say aloud. Such a policy would not take place on empty land. You will find a population in Palestine driving out its present inhabitants, he warned, taking all the best of the country. Montagu did not speak as a Palestinian nationalist. He spoke as a British cabinet minister who believed the state was about to validate anti-Semitism abroad while pretending to perform justice at home. In a perverse way, he understood the imperial psychology better than the empire did. He knew that a government which still treated Jews as a category to be managed could easily cloak old prejudice in new benevolence. This is where the story becomes more than a simple tale of empire favoring Zionism. Some of the same British political culture that produced sympathy for a Jewish national home had also produced hostility to Jewish immigration. Arthur Balfour himself had backed the 1905 Aliens Act aimed in significant part at restricting Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. The contradiction is not incidental, it is central. The declaration could function at once as philo-Zionist and anti-Semitic, protective and exclusionary, biblical and bureaucratic. It offered Jews a future elsewhere while leaving unexamined how Jewish belonging in Britain and Europe would then be imagined. Montagu saw the trap. He was overruled. Now the deeper contradiction can be stated plainly. Britain did not simply promise Palestine to Zionists. It promised overlapping futures to multiple audiences for different wartime reasons. To Arab leaders, it had suggested post-Ottoman independence in the Hussein McMahon correspondence. To the French, it had accepted the secret logic of Sykes-Picot, which envisaged much of Palestine under international administration. To Zionists, it now offered a national home. Each commitment had its own context, its own wording, its own defenders, but on the ground they were irreconcilable. Britain was not solving the future of Palestine, it was postponing the cost of contradiction. That is why the phrase "sold Palestine" has such force, even though it is not literally accurate. Britain did not own Palestine in 1917, it could not sell what it did not lawfully possess. No contract transferred sovereign title from the Arab inhabitants to Lord Rothschild's account books. But British officials did do something structurally similar to a sale. They treated political promise as a tradable instrument. They offered support for a national project in a territory inhabited overwhelmingly by Arabs, more than 90% of the population at the time, by one summary, in the expectation that the offer would yield value elsewhere. Strategic position, wartime propaganda, influence in Washington, influence in Russia, perhaps even help with the crushing burden of war finance. In that sense, Palestine became collateral in an imperial debt crisis of legitimacy and money. And the language of the declaration itself reveals the trade. The Jews were named as a people. The Arabs of Palestine, the majority, were described only as the existing non-Jewish communities. Their civil and religious rights were noted. Their political rights vanished into syntax. That was not an oversight, it was the mechanism. To promise one national future, another national existence had to be linguistically blurred. A sentence did the first act of dispossession by changing who counted as a subject of history. Here is where the financial thread collides with the moral thread. If British ministers had merely been religious romantics, the declaration might have remained a pious flourish. If they had merely been cold strategists, they might have chosen a different instrument. What made Balfour possible was the convergence of imperial geography, wartime desperation, Christian Zionist sentiment, Zionist lobbying, and the belief, part fantasy, part prejudice, that Jewish influence in finance and politics could be mobilized for the Allied cause. Not one cause, several, layered together, enough to move policy. The aftermath was not immediate in the way popular memory likes. The declaration did not produce Israel overnight or expel Palestinians the next morning. History is slower and therefore crueler. First came the mandate. In the Versailles Order and the Mandate system that followed, Britain was entrusted with the administration of Palestine under terms that incorporated the logic of the Declaration. What had begun as wartime correspondence hardened into international architecture. A sentence became policy, policy became administration, administration became institutions. Under the British Mandate, the asymmetry widened. British rule facilitated Jewish immigration and the building of self-governing institutions, economic networks, military capacities, and political agencies that would later form the infrastructure of a state. At the same time, Palestinian Arabs were denied equivalent political sovereignty. The Declaration's verbal imbalance became a governing imbalance. It was not that every British official intended every later consequence. It was that the framework they chose made those consequences more likely and Palestinian resistance more inevitable. Demography tells part of the story. According to one summary, Jews constituted less than 10% of Palestine's population at the time of the Declaration. Between 1922 and 1935, under the Mandate, the Jewish population rose from about 9% to nearly 27% of the total population. That change did not happen in a vacuum. It happened under imperial protection, amid land purchases, institution building, labor conflict, political exclusion, and escalating fear on all sides. Every percentage point carried human weight. Palestinian opposition was neither incidental nor delayed by ignorance. The King-Crane Commission found strong opposition to Zionism among Palestinians. Palestinian congresses denounced British policy. Writers such as Khalil Sakakini described a society shaken awake by war, Zionism, and illegal policy. Violence appeared early. So did censorship. So did the gradual realization among Palestinians that Britain was not a neutral mandatory power but a state administering a contradiction it had itself authored. And then there is the Long Bill. In 1948, after the end of the Mandate and amid war, more than 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled in what Palestinians call the Nakba. Entire towns and villages were emptied. A refugee question was born that still has not ended. If one wants to measure the price of the Declaration, it cannot be done only in pounds sterling or treasury dollars. It must also be measured in statelessness, camps, exile, memory, and the repetition of emergency across generations. The British cost was different but real. The empire did not emerge strengthened from its experiment in cleverness. It emerged entangled. The debt burden remained heavy in the interwar years. Debt interest consumed roughly a quarter of receipts on average. Britain's imperial system survived the First World War but on altered foundations, increasingly dependent on American finance and increasingly unable to pretend that global commitments came cheap. The Declaration did not save Britain from decline, it merely showed what decline sounds like when spoken in the language of strategic confidence. This is why the document still unsettles. It is small enough to seem manageable. Clean paper, formal prose, a restrained tone. Yet behind it sits the whole apparatus of modern power: wartime borrowing, imperial rivalry, religious sentiment, ethnic stereotype, lobbying, legal ambiguity, and the casual belief that the wishes of the local majority can be subordinated to a larger design. Edward Said later described the Declaration as a European power making a promise about a non-European territory in disregard of the native majority. It is hard to improve on that sentence because it captures both the arrogance and the distance. The people most affected were not in the room. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly where serious history separates from tabloid history. The Balfour Declaration was not a literal banking contract in which the Rothschilds bought Palestine to settle Britain's war debts. That claim is too simple, and worse, it slides too easily into recycled anti-Semitic mythology. Lord Rothschild was the recipient of the letter and a political figure in British Jewish life, not the sole puppeteer of British foreign policy. No responsible reading of the evidence supports the fantasy of one secret banking hand moving everything. But the opposite mistake is just as misleading. It is not responsible to pretend the financial dimension was irrelevant. British war costs were catastrophic. External borrowing was central. British officials did explicitly hope support for Zionism would help with the burdens of war and influence the United States. Historians disagree on emphasis, not on the existence of this context. Jonathan Schneer stresses wartime expediency and Britain's desire to enlist supposed Jewish influence. James Renton emphasizes propaganda, imperial calculation, and elite beliefs about Jewish power. Other accounts underline the Suez Canal, rivalry with France, Christian Zionism, and humanitarian concern for persecuted Jews in Europe. All of these motives can be true at once. That is the uncomfortable answer, not conspiracy, convergence. And convergence is often how the worst decisions are made. No single villain has to rise from the shadows if enough respectable men each bring one rationalization to the table. One brings the debt figures, one brings the map, one brings the Bible, one brings the memo about American opinion, one brings the polished phrase national home. One notes, almost as an afterthought, that the local majority has not been consulted. Then the paper is signed. In the end, the Balfour Declaration reveals something larger than the history of one place. It shows what happens when power becomes convinced that money, war, and language can be braided into one instrument and then aimed at a distant population with limited immediate consequence. For a while, that technique works. The balance sheet improves a little, the alliance feels firmer, the cabinet minute closes, the newspaper prints the letter, men in London believe they have acted with grandeur, then time begins its audit. The people written around return to the center of the story. The phrases chosen for tactical ambiguity harden into decades of conflict. The empire that believed it was buying flexibility discovers it has purchased obligation, revolt, and historical blame. And the financial desperation that helped shape the moment is forgotten because states prefer to remember their pronouncements as moral acts rather than emergency instruments. Yet the ledger is there if you look closely enough. Debt soaring from £651 million to £771 billion, wartime spending leaping into the billions, U.S. loans remaking the hierarchy of the Atlantic world, and one small letter offering up Palestine as if a strategic promise could outrun its own human consequences. That may be the most unsettling lesson of all. Empires do not always collapse because they are weak. Sometimes they are most dangerous when they are overextended, still prestigious, still eloquent, still able to turn a crisis of finance into a sentence of destiny for somebody else. They call it policy, later generations call it tragedy. Both are true, and if one word captures the role Palestine played in that moment, it may be this: collateral, not in the narrow legal sense, in the imperial sense. A land, a people, and a future pledged into a wider struggle over money, war, and power. If that word strikes you as too harsh, look again at the numbers, the timing, the letter, and the lives that followed from it. If you've made it this far, write the word collateral in the comments, not as a slogan, as a reminder that behind every polished declaration there may be a balance sheet no one wants to read aloud. And if you come to this channel for the hidden ledgers beneath official history, subscribe and stay with us for the next account. The powerful hoped time would quietly close.